Welcome! In this series of videos, we will look at software add-ons for the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today, we will look again at the MyLocalGrid custom grid and how to import data into your grid. This was the application at the end of our last video. We have a dialog on which there is a custom grid, which is MyLocalGrid. It has a number of columns. The first column we've made read-only and generated with a record number between 1 and 50. We have 3 columns which are editable, a division column which is a drop-down list which you can select from, and the final column, the active column, which is a tick box. We also have a hidden column for the employee number which is not visible to the user. What we're going to do today is to bulk load a CSV file containing data into this grid. But first of all, we have to generate the data. We're going to make use of some software we prepared in a previous video. This is our Generate Data application. This is designed to produce a certain number of randomly generated data records. We have CSV files which contain a certain number of records for each of the columns we're interested in. We have a file for surnames, a much larger file for first names, a smaller file for departments, and a file for divisions. If we look at the code itself, we'll see that in our code, this application can either run in the console compiler or the Windows compiler. And it makes use of the file handling routines library and the random routines library. There's a constant set at the beginning of the code which sets the maximum number of records that the application will generate. We have it set for 50 records at the moment, as our MyLocalGrid custom grid has 50 rows in it, and it's 50 rows we initially wish to populate. We are setting a constant to be the name of the file we're going to output to contain these records, and we're calling that file datafile.csv. When the application runs, it will first build a graphics window. The graphics window is used to display progress to the user for how the program is progressing. We will then call the generate file function. It will first load each of these CSV files into an individual array. It will prepare the header, which is to match the header in our grid for the ID, first name, surname, department, division, and active columns. And having loaded the data into these individual arrays, we will then run through a for next loop from 1 to the maximum number of records we wish to generate. And we will get a value, a random value, out of each of these arrays, and we will output this as a string to our output file. So if we run this now, it will generate 50 records very quickly. So we have a look in the folder, we can see there is now a datafile.csv. If we have a look at that, we'll see there's a header line which contains the headers we expect, and 50 records of data. So now that we've generated that file, let's copy it into the directory. And here we are back at the application. Since we're going to be making use of one of the functions within the file handling routines library, we need to put the include statement right at the beginning of the code. And the next thing to do is we will set up our constant to define the name of the file we wish to pull in and populate the grid with, datafile.csv. And having got that in place, let's now have a look at the callback function, the event handler of our dialog. In here, we're setting up things like the data going into the grid. So we're going to put our code in here. So we're going to create a new function whose job it is to load the CSV file and populate the grid. We'll call this function load the data. And the function will take a single parameter, which as you've probably guessed, will be the Windows handle to the grid itself. So now we have our new load the data function with its single parameter. Since we're going to be loading this CSV file into an array, we have dimensioned an array within this function. And here is where we make use of the library in our file handling routines. This function we're going to be using is read the CSV file into an array. As the name of the function suggests, this is going to load our array. It will need two parameters, the first one being the location and path to the file we wish to load. This will be in the same folder as the executable and the constant we have defined at the beginning of the application. Our second parameter is the pointer to our array into which we want to load the data. And if this function returns true, it means the function has successfully loaded the file into the array. So how will we now get the array data into our MyLittleGrid? The MyLittleGrid include library ships with it an inbuilt function called MLG putX. This is an extended version of the MLG put function. Its primary purpose is to populate grids with what is in an array. So this single line of code is going to do all the work for us. It takes 4 parameters. The first parameter is the grid handle. The second parameter is the array we want to load into the grid. And the last 2 parameters are key to how the grid is actually populated and displayed to the user. The last parameter is the refresh option. This, as we've seen before, is either going to be 1 or 0. If it is 1, then the data in the grid is redisplayed right away to the user. If the value is 0, it will not display to the user until we do a grid refresh. As we want the user to see the data that's come in from the file, we'll set this value to 1. That just leaves the value in the long option. MyLittleGrid has 4 options here. There is an option to allow us to take the data within the grid, which does contain headers, and we can update the grid headers in this one function call alone. As we've already got headers in our grid, we don't at the moment want to rewrite them. So we're going to go for option number 2. We're not going to overwrite our headers. We're going to leave the headers as they were set up in our dialog. So we'll set the option value to number 2. So a quick compile to make sure we haven't missed anything. And we'll try running that code now. As you can see, we now have a populated grid. We have our name columns populated, we have the department, we have the division, and we even have the active column, either being ticked or not ticked. The division column is still selectable by a drop-down list, the currently populated value being highlighted, and it allows you to change the value. However, our first column, which we had pre-populated, is now completely blank. This is because the data in the CSV file had a blank value for everything in the ID column. So how can we redraw that? If we have a look at the callback function or event handler, we'll see our call to fill the column with row numbers appears right at the beginning. This is before our call to load the data. So if we simply comment that function out and place it after the load the data. This will load the data first and then populate the ID column. If we run the code now, we will see we now have a populated ID column which is still read-only. So we have 50 rows of data, all correctly populated, coming from the CSV file. Since we have pre-configured the grid to be 50 rows, what would happen if we gave the grid 60 rows of data? More data than it is configured to hold. Let's go back to our generate program and generate some more random data. If we amend that to make it 60, generate our file, go back in, have a look at our data file, we'll see that it now contains 61 rows, a header row and 60 lines of data. We'll then copy that file into our main code file. And if we just try running the executable again, we'll see it still runs quite happily. There are still only 50 rows of data in the grid, even though we had loaded from the CSV file 60 data rows. So how can we get the grid to expand when we give it more data? MyAutoGrid has an extra option we can use when we're using the MLG putX command. The option which we're currently using is option number 2. If any of our options are actually negative, then the grid will automatically be resized to fit the data within the array. So if we change this 2 to a -2 and run our application now, we can see that the grid, while populated, appears to have lost some of its colour highlighting. But if we move down to the bottom of the grid, we will see we do actually have 60 rows of data. But why is our colour highlighting not working properly now? Well, if we go back to the dialog settling itself, we'll see that after we actually define the grid, we're calling the colour bank grid rows before the data is loaded. If we comment this out and take this section of code, and we'll put this into our callback function. After the values have been loaded into the grid, we're then going to colour bank the grid rows. If we try running the code now, we'll see that our grid highlighting is now back to normal. So if you're loading a large amount of information into a grid and you wish to colour bank your rows, do the colour banking after the data is loaded, because at that point the colour banking will know exactly how many rows and how many columns it needs to colour bank for. If we go down to the bottom of the grid, we'll see we have our 60 rows all colour banked successfully. So in summary, what we've achieved today is we've taken our MyAutoGrid custom grid, which has initially been set up for 50 rows of data. We have taken a CSV file containing randomly generated data and loaded this into the grid. And we've set the grid to extend and get bigger as we give it more data. We have still got all our tick boxes for the active column. The division column is still drop-down lists, and the other columns are editable. And our first column, the ID column, we have populated with the row numbers, and that is a read-only column. What we'll do in our next video is we'll extend the configuration of the grid. We'll show you how you can add a custom user button to any cell in the grid itself. But that's it for today. Thank you for watching.